Welcome to the SoberQ podcast.
What fears did I discover through taking inventory? It's a really good question, and to me it throws a light on the inventory process itself. And as we all know, that starts with inventorying resentments and then fears and then sex harms. And what's interesting about the resentments inventory, which is where I discovered a lot of my fears, was in that question, it was fear involved. And if you read the big book about the resentment inventory, it refers to the example, Mrs. Brown, she's a nut, or whoever the nut was is a nut. I love that table, by the way. I sometimes feel a bit naughty if I'm asked to choose a reading from the big book at the end of a meeting. I always want to choose the table and just read it out because they feel like characters in a sitcom. But I don't. I usually choose something a bit more profound. But there is a point where it talks about how often fear was a part of the resentment inventory process. And that's where I discovered this connection between resentment, our first inventory, and then fears. And obviously that's where I discovered fears that I wouldn't have put into my fears inventory, like obvious things that I know I'm anxious or afraid of. That's where I discovered a whole new bunch of fears and how corrosive a thread fear is in regards to impacting my perceptions that create things like resentments and sex harms. In the world of sales, people talk about customers will buy to avoid pain more than to seek pleasure. And I think that goes to the heart of how prevalent fears are. I'm constantly choosing to behave in a certain way to avoid feeling uncomfortable or fearful. And the thing is, I don't need a particular situation to trigger my fear. It's almost like an overlay, a filter that I look at life through unless I'm being spiritual, whereas I need a specific situation, person, place, or thing to be resentful. I've never felt generally resentful. I've felt situationally or specifically resentful. But when I looked at the fears that were attached to that first inventory, resentments, there were filter fears, as I call them, fears that are there across many aspects, if not all aspects of my life. Fear of failure, fear of success. How's that for irony? Fear of missing out, fear of not being heard. These uber fears that I would never have caught if I'd started with the fears inventory, because that would have been spiders. That would have been snakes, situational fears. But the fears that really paralysed me whilst I was drinking, and equally the fears that continue to paralyse me today if I'm disconnected from God, are the uber fears, the filter fears. Fear of missing out, as I say. Fear of not being loved. Fear of not being enough. Fear of picking up a drink. And of course, that allowed my fears inventory to be a deeper and richer experience. What's interesting about the fears inventory is this, though. As opposed to the resentment inventory, where I am asked to kind of think about why I had the resentments, if you read the big book, it tells us why we have fears. Was not self-reliance the reason? A reliance on the finite self as opposed to the infinite God. And I found that very relieving, that I didn't have to think about where my fears came from. The book tells me. And so each inventory is, in and of itself, a very unique, sequenced process. Thank God that it is. I learnt so much through it. Thanks for letting me share.
If you would like to share your experience on a recovery question, visit the SoberQ podcast website at SoberQ.com. Thanks for listening.